There was something different in Jung's gaze. It wasn't the weariness of another day dealing with troubled minds, nor the weight of the notes piling. It was something else. Ancient restlessness, a feeling of being confronted with a mystery that touched the very boundaries of human consciousness. He had spent years studying dreams, archetypes, symbols, trying to understand the patterns that move the soul. Faced with these specific patients, something in his perception unraveled. Worn veil. They didn't react like ordinary. Their suffering seemed to conceal an invisible intelligence, a silent force that observed, recorded, and understood with a precision bordered on the impossible. Jung noted in his diary, "They are not just feeling the world, they are mapping it." This phrase haunted him for months. What he saw before him were not people shattered by pain, consciousnesses in a state of heightened wakefulness. They were individuals who, even when hurt, demonstrated an uncanny ability to perceive what was moving in the hidden layers of human relations. It was as if every word, gesture, or look became a given for them, a piece of an emotional puzzle that the rest of the world didn't even realize existed. And the more Jung listened to them, the more he understood that he was facing something that psychology itself didn't yet have the language to describe. These empaths, as he came to, seemed to possess a perception that surpassed the rational intellect. They observed the invisible with eyes of the soul. While most people reacted to their surroundings instinctively, they analyzed. They kept detailed mental records of the people around them, as if constructing behavioral maps with the precision of a surgeon. They knew the weaknesses and masks of others without ever having read a book on the subject. They knew how to spot lies before they were spoken, sensed the weight of a hidden intention before it became an act. It was a kind of lucidity not learned from books, but born of living with pain and the close observation of human imperfection. Most disconcerting, however, was that these individuals rarely used this knowledge. They remained silent, repressed by a culture that called them too sensitive. Society had taught them to apologize for perceiving what others didn't. And Jung, who always sought to understand the mind as a mirror of the collective unconscious, began to realize that these empaths were more than patients. They were living portals. They manifested in concrete ways the eternal struggle between consciousness and shadow, between the instinct to understand and the fear of seeing too much. In his notes, Jung described this phenomenon as a latent psychic intelligence, an advanced stage of human intuitive function. While others lost themselves in superficial emotional reactions, empaths analyzed patterns, anticipated outcomes, and, paradoxically, suffered from being unable to turn off this perception. Jung saw in them a form of quiet genius, a genius the world mistook for fragility. The same gift that allowed them to read people's deep intentions also condemned them to carry emotional burdens that were not. He began to wonder, what happens when such a sensitive mind is forced to exist in a deaf society? When does lucidity become a prison? What if empathy, rather than a gift, is a form of spiritual insight still misunderstood? The questions multiplied, and Jung sensed he was at a turning point in the very understanding of the human soul. Once, after a long session, one of these patients told him something he never forgot. "I don't just feel what others feel. I see what they avoid feeling." This phrase resounded like a thunderclap within Jung. Therein lay the key. The empath was not a victim of excessive emotion, but an observer of what the world rejects in itself. He saw the unconscious of others in full activity, the shadows moving behind civilized gestures, and this made him dangerous to those who preferred the comfort of ignorance. Over time, Jung began to notice that these people exhibited the same pattern of behavior, a mixture of extreme perception and profound exhaustion. They lived as if they carried the burden of understanding the entire world but had no right to express what they knew. When they tried to speak, they were accused of exaggeration. When they remained silent, they became ill. Jung saw this as the starkest portrayal of the conflict between the soul and civilization. The empath was the mirror that society tried to break because it could not bear to see its own reflection. He spent entire nights reflecting on this paradoxical nature. The empath, he thought, is like an antenna that captures invisible emotional frequencies, but at the same time suffers from the noise of the world. He is an observer and a victim, a healer and a prisoner. His gift brings him closer to the truth, but isolates him from humanity. This contradiction transformed him into an almost mythical figure within the living laboratory that was Jung's mind. It was then that he began to realize something even more disturbing. These people who he thought were collapsing weren't collapsing. They're reconfiguring. Their emotional disruptions weren't the end. They were the beginning of a new state of consciousness. Pain was merely the empath's mind, under pressure, didn't fragment, expanded. It was as if every disappointment, every betrayal, every humiliation acted as code, decoding truths that until then had been buried deep in the collective unconscious. Jung realized with astonishment that he was witnessing a phenomenon of inner evolution. These sensitive minds seemed to tap into a kind of archetypal wisdom, universal intelligence, habits all beings, but rarely awake. It was as if the empath was a bridge between the human and the transcendent, between suffering and understanding. He began to call them interpreters of the soul, people who, when hurt, translated their pain into symbolic language. With each session, Jung felt he was not just the therapist, he was the apprentice. He observed his patients with the reverence of someone witnessing the manifestation of something sacred. The words, the gestures, the pauses and the gaze, everything revealed a wisdom that came not from the inner, from the experience of feeling the world fully. And then, for the first time, Jung understood that empathy was not a moral quality, but a spiritual function. The power to see the other as an extension. However, there was a price. The empath paid with their own peace for the gift of understanding. The mind that sees too much also hurts itself too much. The heart that feels the whole world inevitably bleeds. Jung knew that this gift without guidance could become a curse. Therefore, he began to view empaths not as sick people, but as involuntary initiates of a psychological journey that the world was not yet ready to stand. And it was at this point that he wrote one of his most enigmatic phrases: "All light is born from the darkness that dared to know itself." For Jung, the empath was the very embodiment of this truth. He sought not the power to control, but the power to understand. He was a traveler of the psyche, traversing the fine line between the human and the divine. While others fled from their emotions, he studied them. While others lied to themselves, he endured the truth. But what would happen if one day these beings stopped hiding? If their consciousness, previously silent, decided to express itself with all its power? Jung began to fear and admire this possibility at the same time. He knew that if the empath ever united his sensitivity with reason and his pain with lucidity, the entire world would have self. Because nothing is more transformative or more dangerous than a soul that has learned to see. So, as Jung closed his notes that night, recorded something that would mark the beginning of a new era in his research. "It is not the empaths who intrigue me. It is what is awakening through them." The flame had been lit, and the world, unknowingly, was about to be wiped. Jung knew that the human mind rarely reveals its secrets, and it speaks through symbols, gestures, and silences. So when he decided to test his observations about empaths, he didn't plan a typical clinical experiment. He didn't want graphs or numbers. He wanted to witness the invisible in action. One autumn morning, he brought a group of unrelated people into his office. On one side, patients he called sensitive observers. On the other, fellow analysts, psychology students. He didn't explain the reason for the meeting. He simply asked them to sit face to face and exchange a few words. The result left him silent for long. In a matter of moments, one of the empaths described, with almost disconcerting calm, the lonely childhood of one of his classmates, mentioning the emotional absence of his father, a secret fear of failure, and a repetitive pattern. Another identified, without hesitation, the unresolved grief of a woman who had lost her mother 10 years earlier. The atmosphere grew heavy, as if the air had become visible. No one there understood how these people could know so much without knowing anything. Jung simply watched, staring intently, feeling he was witnessing a phenomenon that eluded traditional explanation. As he wrote down the result, his hands trembled, not from fear, from astonishment. He understood that extreme sensitivity wasn't just emotion, expanded cognition. The empath did. He read signals that everyone emitted, but almost no one noticed. Micro-expressions, pauses, subtle tremors in the voice, imperceptible changes in breathing, all became mental data. What the world called intuition was actually an advanced type of emotional perception. Jung wrote, "They see the truth before it has form." The revelation deeply disturbed him. The man who had dedicated his life to studying the unconscious now realized that there were minds naturally attuned to it. But what struck him most was that these empaths, for all their abilities, didn't consider themselves special. Contrary, carried shame. Many recounted how, since childhood, they had been labeled as fragile, dramatic, and some remembered teachers telling them they were distracted or slow, when in fact, they were simply absorbing the entire environment. Others recalled relationships where they were accused of thinking too much, feeling too much, perceiving too much. So, to survive, they learned to hide what these stories began to repeat themselves with disturbing regularity. Jung saw in them the same cycle: the empathic child who senses family tensions before adults admit it, the adolescent who senses the falseness in friends' words, the adult who, without understanding why, carries a deep weariness at the end of each conversation. It was the burden of capturing unspoken emotions, of constantly living in a state of involuntary observation. The sensitivity that should have been a gift, silent curse. He began to think of empaths as high-frequency human receivers, people who grasp emotional truth before it's spoken. And like all receivers, they suffer when surrounded by noise. Jung saw clearly. These people's suffering came not just from personal pain, but from constant exposure to the lies and disguises. They lived overwhelmed by a kind of collective emotional pollution. In his notes, he described this as the fatigue of the lucid soul. During a session, a woman said to him, "Doctor, sometimes I feel the air change when someone lies." Jung didn't. He knew that human perception is much deeper than science dares. The body reacts to subtle fields of emotion, and the empath, for some still unexplained reason, is a body that listens. It perceives the unsaid, the camouflaged intentions, the small tremor that betrays the truth. This invisible listening was also the cause of his suffering. There is no rest for those who feel everything. But there was something. Despite their exhaustion, these individuals displayed, in moments of clarity, calm, almost unshakable strength. It was as if their pain had trained them to see the world without illusion. Some recounted experiences and sensed the collapse of a relationship days before it happened, or realized a friend was lying without being able to lie. Others spoke of encounters in which they sensed something dark before discovering a betrayal. Jung called this the instinct of the invisible, the ability to read the energy field of human emotions. These experiences began to awaken in him a mixture of fascination and fear. What if these people were the harbinger of a new kind of mind, a mind that evolved not to react, but to understand? Jung began to compare the empath's brain to the structure of a psychological radar and instrument capable of detecting emotional storms from a distance. The difference is that, while a conventional radar serves as defense, empath uses theirs to stand. Even when everything within them calls for escape, they remain observing. This willingness to see what is painful was, for Jung, the clearest sign of psychic maturity. Most people run from what hurts. The empath observes until they understand. And that's where their power is born. The power to transform emotion into wisdom. But he also realized the price of this. Every empath reaches a saturation point, limit where empathy becomes overload. And at that point, a simple event can be the trigger that changes everything. A betrayal, a humiliation, an injustice. Something awakens what was dormant. Silent observation gives way to a lucidity that frightens. Jung began to understand that these moments were not breakdowns, but awakenings. The empath's mind, when pressed, reveals its true nature. Consciousness that not only feels, but deeply understands. He wrote, "The empath does not go mad. He passes through the looking glass, and in doing so, he sees what the rest of humanity tries to hide, the emotional gears that drive lies, fear, love, and power." From then on, Jung began to question the very role of psychology. Were empaths ill, or were they pioneers of a new way of perceiving? Perhaps what we call disorder was simply the growing pains of an expanding conscience. He saw in these individuals something that the rest of the world would still call sensitivity, but which he recognized as the harbinger of a new psychological function. In conversations with colleagues, Jung rarely mentioned the term empath. He knew he would be ridiculed. He spoke only of advanced intuitives. Deep down, he understood he was dealing with something that didn't fit within the confines of traditional science. Psychology, still in its infancy, these individuals already tread the realm of the soul. Sometimes, during his reflections, Jung imagined what would happen if these people stopped seeing themselves and began to recognize themselves for what they truly are. Soul readers, translators of the visible. He saw in this awakening the same potential for a silent revolution, because when an empath understands their gift, they cease to be a mirror and become a beacon. Still, there was something that deeply disturbed him. These empaths, so attentive to others, rarely turned that gaze in. They knew how to decipher the world, but they didn't know how to protect themselves. They had the wisdom of observation, but not the art of limiting themselves. And Jung began to realize that the essential lesson these beings learned was not to feel less, but to choose better what to feel. True empowerment came not from isolation, from awareness. In his final notes on this phase, Jung wrote a sentence that seemed like a warning. The empath is the guardian between the visible and the invisible. The danger is not in feeling too much, but in forgetting who is feeling. He then understood that the cure for these individuals would not come from the suppression of sensitivity, but from the integration of mind and heart between observation. They didn't need to be anesthetized, they needed to be understood. And perhaps, he thought, the future of psychology depended precisely on this integration, transforming feeling into science, science into compassion. That night, as he finished his notes, Jung turned off the light in his office and fell silent. Through the window, the reflection of his own shadow watched. He smiled slightly, aware that he had crossed another frontier of human understanding. In his mind, he murmured, "Not fragile. They are the living reminder that the soul still sees." The experiment was over, but the mystery had only just begun. Something, inside and outside the human mind, had just awakened. Jung believed that the human mind, when pushed beyond its limits, does not break. It reveals itself. This conviction matured during years of studying what he called clarity events. These were moments when an empath, during long periods of abuse, manipulation, or disillusionment, would stop reacting emotionally and begin to see with almost superhuman clarity. The moment when pain ceased to be emotion and transformed into understanding. No screaming, no fury, just a calm that made one humble. Jung described this serenity as the most powerful manifestation of the unconscious, the moment when the soul decides to stop trading. And these episodes fascinated and frightened him at the same time. He observed that the trigger was almost always betrayal. Not just any kind of betrayal, but betrayal by those the empath trusted most. Parents, spouses, friends, mentors, people in whom they had invested their very essence. The impact came not from the act itself, but from the sudden realization that the empath had known all along. That all the signs were there, visible, insistent, but ignored in the name of kindness. It was the clash between lucidity and illusion. And in that clash, something ancient and dormant. One such patient, remembered by Jung in his diaries, described the feeling this way: "When I discovered it, I didn't cry. It was as if a veil had fallen and the world became too clear. I couldn't unsee it." This phrase echoed in the analyst's mind for years. He realized that the empath, upon reaching the limit, doesn't go mad. It's the moment when the mind stops trying to heal the other and begins to understand that true healing begins with one's own truth. At this point, suffering isn't destruction, but reorganization. Emotional chaos is replaced by a cool lucidity that doesn't judge, only recognizes. But what exactly awakens in this? Is it the unconscious seeking balance? Is it the self, the deepest part of the psyche, taking control? Or is it something that transcends the mind itself, a higher consciousness using pain as a portal? Jung noticed that after this snap, the empath's behavior changed radically. They stopped trying to understand the aggressor and began observing him with the eyes of a scientist. There was no anger, only analysis. Every lie, every manipulation, every attempt at control was mentally registered as. And for Jung, this was the true moment of integration. When emotion becomes objective perception, the empath doesn't lose sensitivity, they heighten it. They transform suffering into knowledge. It was common for these people to report a feeling of emptiness after the clarity event. Not a depressive emptiness, but a new, almost sacred silence. "It's as if I've stopped playing the game," said one of them. Jung understood perfectly. When the mind reaches this point, it transcends the human drama and sees psychological movements as mechanical gear. What was once personal becomes symbolic. The empath begins to see archetypes: the traitor, the manipulator, the innocent, the redeemer, and no longer just individuals. They see the human soul functioning behind the social mask. But what remains after this revelation? How can we continue living in a world where lies are the norm and lucidity becomes isolation? Jung asked himself this question in his nightly notes, knowing that the awakening of consciousness comes at the price of solitude. Clarity doesn't just illuminate, it separates. He observed that many of these empaths experienced a curious phenomenon. They became unnaturally calm. This tranquility frightened those around them. It was the kind of serenity that came not from resignation, from understanding. As if the empath, after the breakdown, had found an unshakable inner. They do not attack, Jung wrote. They only reveal. The tone was almost clinical, but the implication was philosophical. These individuals reached the point he called shadow integration, the moment when everything that had been denied within oneself finally accepted and consciously used. What's so threatening about serenity? Why does profound calm provoke fear in those who live in control? Jung believed this was the ultimate test of transformation. The integrated empath doesn't need to prove anything. Their presence alone is enough to destabilize manipulators because it reflects the truth. There's no emotional reaction to exploit, no guilt to use leverage. It's as if the emotional predator loses its footing. Jung described this reaction as the avoidance instinct. Fakes shy away from the awakened empath the way eyes avoid bright light. Over time, he noticed a pattern. After this awakening, empaths didn't return to the previous cycle. There was no relapse. It was a permanent transformation. The people who once intimidated them now seemed small. The voices that confused them became distant noise. Jung saw something deeply spiritual in this. The empath, once a mirror of collective suffering, became a mirror of truth. And the world, unable to bear so much reflection. One night, during a conversation with a colleague, Jung compared this process to a mineral that, when subjected to extreme heat, crystallizes. The empath is forged in the fire of betrayal, he said. Pain purifies him until all that remains, consciousness. But what happens when this awakened consciousness begins to move through the world? How does a human being who is seen beyond the masks behave? Reports show that these individuals become more strategic, less calculating. They learn to say no without guilt, to walk away without explaining, to protect their energy without needing to justify it. It was a kind of silent power, almost invisible, but deeply perceptible. People around them described feeling exposed in their presence, as if they could hide nothing. Jung noted that at this stage, the empath had transformed into something new, no longer the wounded, sensitive, calm observer. Most surprising, however, was that these empaths didn't become cold. They remained compassionate, but lucidly so. They knew how to distinguish compassion from connivance, help from sacrifice, love from dependence. Jung called this empathic clarity, the ability to feel deeply without losing discernment. Why are some human beings led to this kind of awakening, and others are not? Could emotional suffering act as a rite of passage for the modern soul? These questions were on Jung's mind. He realized that all of humanity carried the potential for this same process. Only a few had been forced to go through it. Perhaps the difference lay not in giftedness, but in courage. The awakened empath is not the one who feels more, but the one who dares to see what you. And seeing, for Jung, is always the first step towards transformation. He believed that the empath is the living laboratory of psychological. In its pain, the human mind learns to decode itself. In its silence, discovers the language of the unconscious. And when this discovery occurs, the individual ceases to be a hostage to emotions. They become their master. In his last entry from this period, Jung wrote something that seems to resonate to this day. When the soul, tired of feeling, finally decides to understand, the whole world changes place. And that's how he realized true awakening is not mystical or supernatural. It's the moment when someone finally, with total awareness, what has always been there, never sleeps the same way again. Jung believed that every true transformation leaves noticeable traces in behavior, posture, and even the energy the body transmits. That's why, after the first reports of the so-called clarity event began following the lives of awakened empaths with almost obsessive attention, what he discovered intrigued him. None of them returned to their previous state. None fell back into the pattern of blaming themselves, trying to fix others, or justifying themselves for feeling too much. It was as if, after crossing the threshold of pain, they had become beings of a different psychological category, more lucid, more strategic, and paradoxically more peaceful. One of them, months after awakening, told Jung, "I haven't changed my personality. I've just stopped begging the world to allow me to be who I already was." This type of story appeared frequently. People who were previously emotionally dependent, vulnerable to criticism, and extremely self-sabotaging began to demonstrate a serene independence, an impressive clarity in decision-making, and a kind of practical intuition that seemed bordering on the impossible. Jung recorded, in one of his notebooks, the case of a woman who, after breaking off an abusive relationship, reorganized her entire life in 6 months. She opened a small studio, began helping others recognize toxic patterns, and in less than a year, was financially stable and emotionally balanced. When he asked what had changed, she replied, "Nothing external. I simply stopped doubting what I always knew." This phrase stuck in Jung's memory as a perfect summary of integration. The empath doesn't acquire new power, but simply accepts what they already have. Interestingly, this transformation seemed contagious. Jung noticed that family members and close friends of these empaths also underwent change. Some became more aware, as if the empath's lucid behavior acted as an involuntary mirror. Others reacted with resistance or hostility. People accustomed to emotionally dominating the empath began to feel uncomfortable, insecure, even irritated. It was as if the presence of this new state of consciousness triggered an invisible chemical reaction, a kind of natural repulsion between truth and mission. Jung called this phenomenon the avoidance instinct. In his journal entries, he wrote, "The lie senses when the truth enters the room." One of the most intriguing cases involved a Swiss businessman who, after awakening, realized that his team feared him but didn't respect him. Instead of imposing authority, he began applying strategic empathy, a form of active observation inspired by Jung's studies. Within a year, the work environment was transformed. The company's profits increased, but more than that, employees reported a sense of security and unprecedented clarity. The businessman said he learned to read the silence and act on what he perceived in unspoken expressions. Jung was impressed. He saw in this behavior the practical application of what he called conscious empathy, not the act of absorbing emotions, but of understanding them, deciding what to do with them. But not everyone reacted positively to these transformations. There was something about awakened empaths that unsettled the world. Manipulative people, accustomed to controlling through guilt, charm, or victimization, instinctively withdrew from them. Jung described this in biological terms. The emotional predator recognizes the absence of food. The awakened empath offers no drama, justification, or excessive attention. They are a clean mirror, and no manipulator likes to see themselves clearly. The curious thing is that these empaths didn't need to say anything. Their presence was enough. The energy of those who carry clarity seems to expose hidden intentions effortlessly. During his observations, Jung noticed a recurring physical detail. Awakened empaths changed the way they moved and spoke. Their gestures became slower, their voices firmer, their gaze wracked. There was no rigidity, but rather a kind of natural control of space. Some reported that people behaved differently around them. They became quieter, more introspective, or in some cases, nervous. Jung interpreted this as a reflection of the new emotional frequency these individuals emit. Shadow integration, he said, is not just psychological, it is also energetic. When someone fully accepts themselves, the unconscious stops emitting signals of weakness, and the environment responds. In one of his private seminars, Jung told the story of an empath who worked for years at a philanthropic institute. After awakening, he realized that many of his colleagues used altruism as a mask for ego and control. He didn't confront anyone. He simply stopped justifying himself. A few months later, those who thrived on victimhood began to leave on their own. The institution lost some members but began to thrive with those who remained. Jung described the phenomenon as systemic purification, a process in which individual clarity forces the group to organize. He also began studying the physiological impact of the new awareness. He found that many awakened empaths reported improvements in physical symptoms related to stress, migraines, insomnia, palpitations. Some began dreaming of archetypal symbols, broken mirrors, snakes, doors, submerged lights, as if the psyche were signaling a rebirth. Jung saw these dreams as confirmation of his theory that the unconscious communicates through images when the conscious mind is ready. He called this the language of the restored soul. Once, in a letter to a theologian friend, Jung described what he saw as the most advanced stage of this transformation. The awakened empath becomes selectively generous. He feels everything, but only offers energy to those who are also awakened. This selectivity for him was not selfishness, but emotional maturity. Love, when balanced, not an unfiltered surrender, but a controlled flow that respects one's own. It was the opposite of the blind charity that so exhausted empaths before integration. But something deeply intrigued him. Why did some empaths achieve this level of lucidity and others not? Jung began comparing notes, searching for patterns. He discovered that all those who underwent the transformation had faced intensely the confrontation with their own shadow, the recognition of the parts of themselves they had denied. None of them were enlightened in the mystical sense, but they all had one thing in common: radical honesty. They stopped pretending, adapting, and sugarcoating their feelings to be accepted. Jung realized that the true turning point was not suffering, but the decision not to run from it. Curious observation emerged when he revisited his patients' records years later. Some awakened empaths had become therapists, teachers, leaders, or artists, and all, without exception, reported that their new way of seeing the world was irreversible. They claimed to see human intentions with almost automatic clarity, and this made them extremely effective. One of them, a visual artist, reported that he began painting portraits so expressive that clients cried when they saw themselves. "I didn't paint their faces," he said. "I painted what they carried in their eyes." This blend of sensitivity and precision fascinated Jung, but also made him He knew that lucidity without ethics is dangerous. An awakened empath could, if they wished, masterfully manipulate others. After all, those who understand the human heart also understand its. Therefore, Jung began to develop the idea that true psychological enlightenment requires responsibility. The integrated shadow should not become an instrument of power, but of consciousness. In one of his most personal reflections, he wrote, "Those who see everything run the risk of believing they can do everything." It was the warning of someone who understood the depth of gift and the danger of pride. For Jung, the greatness of empaths lay not only in their ability to feel, but in their decision not to use their feelings to dominate. Awakening, guided by compassion, transforms. If guided by vanity, corrupts. Most impressive, however, was how these individuals became silent beacons. Jung noticed that, in the communities where they lived, conflicts decreased, environments became more harmonious, and even strangers opened up easily around them. It wasn't charisma, it was coherence. The energy of those who live in truth creates security, and where there is security, the risk falls. At the end of his notes on this phase, Jung concluded that awakened empaths represented an evolutionary leap in the human psyche. Not a biological leap, but a psychological. Beings capable of uniting sensitivity and discernment, emotion and strategy, love and lucidity. He wrote, "These people are the bridge between the human and what the human can still be." What Jung witnessed in this process went beyond the realm of psychology. It was a glimpse of the future. A future where consciousness is no longer synonymous with suffering, but with inner freedom. Empaths, who had once been seen as fragile, now walked lightly and firmly, silently redefining what it means to be strong. Their transformation proved something Jung never forgot. True enlightenment is not the end of pain, but mastery over meaning. And from this mastery comes the power to choose what to feel, what to silence. Above all, what Jung began to call the new phase of awakened empaths, the architecture of consciousness. He noticed that, after integration, they not only changed their behavior, but also began to operate their minds strategically, almost mathematically. It was as if their suffering had left a map. Now, finally, they knew how to read it. The clarity that had previously served only to perceive the pain of others became a tool for creation. And it was at this point that Jung began to notice something new and intriguing. Transformed empaths not only healed themselves, but created systems around them that also healed them. One such case involved a young teacher who had spent years sacrificing himself to please colleagues and students. After awakening, he decided to redesign his classes based on what he sensed in his students, not what they said, but what they avoided saying. The results were astonishing. The students began to open up emotionally and improve their performance, as if someone had finally heard what they couldn't express. Jung noted that conscious empathy, when applied purposefully, could be more powerful than any pedagogical technique. The human soul responds to truth with the same relief with which the body responds to air. Not all transformations were smooth. Jung observed that the more lucid the empath became, more the world around them reacted. Old relationships fell apart, colleagues drifted away, and even professional structures collapsed. It was as if the empath, by adjusting their own frequency, destabilized any system that thrived on deception or dissimulation. This was the most painful part of the process, realizing that the clarity once desired also brought inevitable loss. He noted in one of his notebooks, "Truth liberates, but first it disorganizes." One day, one of the empaths told Jung about a dream that left him uneasy. In the dream, he walked through a maze of mirrors. At every turn, he saw a different version of himself: child, victim, culprit, aggressor, until he realized that all the reflections were staring back at him at once. At the center of the maze was a single door. On passing through, he found only an empty. "I didn't see myself," Jung understood immediately. The void was the symbol of integration, the moment when consciousness ceases to be divided between the observer and the observer. The awakened empath no longer seeks an emotional identity, because he understands that it is the space where all identities transit. But there was something even more surprising. As these empaths evolved, they developed an almost supernatural perception of human systems. Some began to anticipate family conflicts before they arose. Others could predict colleagues' reactions in meetings, sense when a situation was about to change course. Jung called this structural vision, the ability to see emotional patterns as if they were visible gears. He compared this ability to the instinct of a military strategist, but focused on the psychological realm. And most impressively, this vision was neither cold nor calculating. It was guided by a kind of lucid compassion that allowed them to act with precision and humanity at the same time. However, this power brought a dilemma Jung didn't expect. Some empaths began to realize they could influence others with extreme ease. A simple gesture, a word chosen at the right moment, and an entire situation could change. This realization generated fear. Jung realized that the gift of total empathy could become a weapon in the wrong hands. The awakened empath could both heal and manipulate. He then began what he called the study of the ethics of perception. The conclusion was clear. True awakening is only complete when accompanied by responsibility. Seeing others does not give the right to control them. Once, in a conversation with a group of patients, Jung asked, "What would you do if you realized you could move people with a simple look?" The silence that followed was long. One of them replied, "I would close my eyes." Jung noted this answer as one of the wisest he had ever heard. Mastery of empathy lay not in using it, but in knowing when not to use it. It was the difference between power and wisdom. The tension between these two paths began to manifest in the accounts. Some empaths, fascinated by their newfound lucidity, began to act excessively coldly, withdrawing emotionally from others, fearing the loss of their own humanity, plunged back into intense emotion. Jung realized that the balance was delicate. The human mind, once expanded, does not return to its original size, but can become unbalanced if it does not learn to manage its expansion. He warned, "Consciousness without love is as destructive as emotion without." In one of the most enigmatic cases, a woman awakened so profoundly that she claimed to be able to sense people's emotions from a distance. Jung observed her for months. In his diaries, he described how she could predict friends' emotional crises, accidents, and even equipment failure before they happened. Scientifically, he couldn't explain it, but psychologically, he understood the principle. The fully integrated mind tunes into collective patterns. Intuition becomes a direct reading of the collective unconscious. This woman, however, was frightened by her own capacity and decided to live in seclusion. Jung respected her. He understood that not every soul is ready to carry so much perception. These experiences led Jung to a broader reflection. He began to consider the hypothesis that awakened empaths represented not just a psychological category, but an evolutionary stage of humanity. People prepared to live with higher levels of emotional and cognitive perception in a world still built on denial. And perhaps that's why they suffered so much before awakening. The old world needed to reject them so they could build the new. The empath's pain is the world's resistance to consciousness. Even with all the clarity they gained, empaths remain human, felt fear, loneliness, sometimes nostalgia for former innocence. One of them described the feeling as longing for not knowing. Jung understood what he meant. Ignorance is comforting, but awakening is irreversible. The price of seeing is losing the shelter of illusion. Still, he believed that the awakened empath is not condemned to solitude, destined for leadership, not in the sense of power, but of example. As his research progressed, Jung began to perceive a kind of critical point in this process. When the empath fully understands what they are capable of seeing, they don't just observe the world, they begin to shape it. Their actions, decisions, and even the simple way they are present alter the emotional field around them. It is at this point that awakening ceases to be individual and begins to have a collective impact. Consciousness becomes contagious. People around them begin to rethink their attitudes, to see what they previously denied, to heal themselves through observation. Jung saw this as proof that consciousness is transmissible. However, what struck him most was the silence of these empaths. They didn't present themselves as masters or seek followers. They lived discreetly, but radiated lucidity wherever they went. Jung said they were like stones thrown into a lake. The impact is small, but the ripples reach all shores. He believed that the ultimate destiny of every empath was to become this kind of presence, firm, clear, unshakable. At the end of his observations, Jung wrote a sentence that seemed to sum up the entire journey. The awakened empath is the soul that has transformed pain into action. He knew he had reached a boundary between science and mystery, but he also knew that it was at this boundary that the human revealed itself most human. Awakening was not the end of the story, but the prelude to what was to come. The moment when the empath, now the architect of his own mind, prepared to build what no other had dared to imagine, a new form of consciousness capable of healing the world without having to conquer it. Jung believed that every human being carries within them a point of convergence between the visible and the invisible, a place where the rational mind meets the mysterious. It was this point that he observed awakening in integrated empaths. The awakening was not merely psychological, spiritual in its most concrete form. There were no rituals or mystical illumination, something that happened in everyday life. When someone tired of doubting what they felt and finally began to trust their own perception. Jung understood that this trust was the true birth of mature consciousness, a union between feeling and knowing, between the heart and lucidity. He used to say that human consciousness is like a mirror covered in dust. There's no need to create it, just that's what the awakened empath does. They remove, one by one, the layers of conditioning, fear, and guilt that prevent them from seeing. When this cleansing happens, what emerges is something simple, yet powerful. Clarity. Not the arrogant clarity of someone who thinks they have all the answers, but the humble clarity of someone who sees the essential. From there, life begins to reorganize itself naturally. The awakened empath stops wasting energy trying to be understood and starts investing energy in understanding. They discover that true strength comes not from being heard, but from listening with awareness. Jung saw this as a model of transformation accessible to everyone. It wasn't necessary to wait for a devastating crisis to awaken. It was possible to begin consciously through the practice of observation. He recommended something simple and powerful. Before reacting to any situation, stop and observe what you name the emotion. Don't identify. I feel anger is different from I am angry. This seemingly small distinction changes everything. It is in that instant that the shadow ceases to dominate and becomes information. Each time someone practices this conscious pause, the mind takes a step toward integration. But Jung knew this requires courage. Facing one's inner self without hiding behind excuses, one of the most difficult tasks a human being can undertake. The awakened empath doesn't shy away from discomfort. Use it as a compass. Emotional pain ceases to be an enemy and becomes a language. It reveals where something still exists, where the soul demands recognition. By observing without judgment, one learns to translate suffering into action. This is why Jung said, "What you deny submits, what you accept transforms you." Acceptance is not passivity. It is the act of seeing the truth without mask, acting from it with wisdom. One of the most beautiful aspects of Jung's observations was realizing that the more empaths awakened, the simpler their way of living became. They stopped striving for grandeur and began to value the essential silence, respect, time, presence. They learned to say no without guilt, yes without fear. And each time they made conscious choices, they felt less need to control the world, because they understood that control is always a reflection of insecurity. True freedom arises when one learns to trust the flow of one's own perception. Jung believed that upon reaching this state, a human being becomes psychologically invincible, not in the sense of being immune to pain, but in the sense of knowing what to do with it. The awakened empath can be hurt, but not destroyed. They can be disappointed, but not manipulated. They understand that the intentions of others are merely reflections of consciousnesses at different levels of understanding. Instead of fighting the world, they begin to act within it as a silent agent of clarity. And this, for Jung, was the sign of true evolution, transforming personal pain into collective wisdom. But what does this mean for those listening now? It means that awakening isn't something reserved for a select few. It's a daily choice. It's deciding to stop apologizing for saying what others choose to ignore. Understanding that feeling deeply isn't weakness, it's emotional intelligence at its highest level. When you accept what you feel and analyze it without dramatizing, you begin to notice patterns. And these patterns are maps of the unconscious. Following them carefully is learning the language of the soul. And little by little, everything changes. Reactions diminish, perceptions expand. Energy balance, you become more selective, but also more compassionate. Jung observed that when someone reaches this level of consciousness, the outside world begins. Toxic situations lose their power. Manipulative people naturally distance themselves, and new connections, more authentic and healthy, begin to emerge. It's as if the internal vibration readjusts the surrounding reality. He called this psychological synchronicity. The universe responds to the degree of truth you hold. Therefore, the more you live in coherence with what you feel, the more life reorganizes itself in your favor. There was one point Jung always repeated: awakening is not the end, it's the beginning. Integrating the shadow is just the first step on the ladder. After that comes purpose, the conscious use of the gift. The awakened empath doesn't keep their wisdom to themselves. They share, teach, and inspire, even if silently. Their mere presence becomes formative, radiates coherence. Jung believed that if enough people reached this level of consciousness, the entire human collective would begin to change. Individual healing would become social healing. And this is where the script meets the viewer. Because this transformation isn't far off, it can begin now. You don't need to understand all of Jung's concepts to experience it. You just need to take the first step. Observe. Observe your feelings, your thoughts, your impulses. Ask yourself, what am I really feeling right now? Breathe. Listen to your body. With each moment of conscious presence, you move closer to your center. And from this center, every decision becomes clearer. Perhaps Jung's greatest teaching is that light doesn't eliminate shadow, it integrates it. This means you don't need to become a perfect version of yourself. You just need to stop fighting what you are. Perfection is an illusion. Authenticity is liberation. When you accept your own chaos, it reorganizes. When you embrace your own fear, it dissolves. The awakened empath is one who understands that feeling deeply isn't suffering, it's understanding deeply. At the end of his life, Jung wrote, "The task of each soul is to make conscious the part of the universe entrusted to it." This phrase sums up the purpose of every human journey. Perhaps the part of the universe entrusted to you is small: a home, a group, a city, a canal. But if you illuminate it with clarity and truth, and this is how the collective transforms, one awakened being at a time. So, if something within you resonated with this message, don't ignore it. Perhaps it's the beginning of your own integration. Start today by observing your emotions without fear, trusting your intuition more, and acting with awareness. Transform pain into direction, sensitivity into wisdom, silence into power. You don't need permission to awaken. You just need to decide not to go back to sleep. If this video touched you, like, comment, even anonymously, and subscribe to the channel. Share this message with someone who needs a reminder of who they are. Every act of awareness is a spark that ignites another, and the more lights that are lit, the less room there is for shadows.